The mansion stood alone on a hill, surrounded by a thick forest. It had been abandoned for many years, and no one dared to get close to it. The locals whispered about it, saying it was haunted, and anyone who entered would never return. Some said strange sounds echoed from the house at night, others spoke of shadows moving inside, even though the mansion was supposed to be empty. Despite these terrifying stories, a young man named Jack was curious. He had always been fascinated by the old mansion, especially the rumors about a huge portrait of a king that hung in one of the rooms. It was said that the king's eyes followed anyone who looked at it, and anyone who stared at the painting too long would vanish. Jack didn't believe in these superstitions. He was determined to prove they were just stories. On a cloudy afternoon, Jack decided to visit the mansion. He walked up the overgrown path, feeling a strange chill in the air. The mansion's large, broken windows stared down at him, like empty eyes. The front door, though covered in vines and rust, creaked open as if waiting for him to enter. Jack took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, filled with the smell of dust and decay. It was dark, with only a few beams of light peeking through the cracks in the walls. Jack's footsteps echoed loudly as he walked deeper into the house. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional groan of the old wood beneath him. He found himself standing at the foot of a large staircase. He could feel the house watching him, every step he took seemed to make the air grow colder. But Jack wasn't afraid, he was determined to see the portrait. Slowly, he made his way upstairs, his heart beating a little faster with every step. At the end of the hall, he found the room. And there it was, ***, the portrait. The king's eyes stared back at him, dark and lifeless. Jack stood frozen in front of the massive portrait. The king's eyes seemed to follow him, no matter where he moved. At first, Jack tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. After all, the painting was old, and the lighting in the room wasn't the best. But the longer he stared, the more the eyes seemed real. They glowed faintly, like they were alive. Jack stepped closer to the painting, trying to study it more carefully. The king was dressed in grand armor, a crown perched on his head. His face was serious, almost as if he was hiding something. But as Jack moved closer, a chill ran down his spine. The room grew colder, the air thick with something strange. Suddenly, Jack heard something. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, carried on the cold air. He turned around quickly, expecting to see someone behind him, but the room was empty. Just the dark walls and the flickering light from the old chandelier. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't coming from behind him, they were coming from the portrait. The king's eyes glowed brighter, and Jack felt a sudden urge to step closer to the painting. He didn't want to look away, but something in his gut told him he should. "Stay with me." The voice was soft but clear. It echoed through the room, making Jack's blood run cold. He stepped back, confused and terrified. The voice seemed to be calling him, urging him to listen. "You can't leave once you've seen me." Jack spun around, but the room remained the same. The whispers continued, circling him, and the king's eyes seemed to grow even more intense, glowing in the dim light. Jack's heart raced. There was no one else here. No one to help him. He was alone, but he didn't feel safe. The whispers wouldn't stop. They kept growing louder, pulling him closer to the painting, as if the king himself was drawing him in. Jack couldn't move. His feet felt like they were glued to the floor, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The king's eyes still followed him, glowing brighter with every passing second. His heart raced in his chest as a cold sweat covered his skin. He wanted to run, to get out of this room, but his body wouldn't listen. The whispers came again, this time clearer than ever. "Come closer." Jack's body reacted before his mind could catch up. Without realizing what he was doing, he took a step toward the painting. His heart thudded in his chest as he slowly moved closer to the portrait. The room seemed darker now, the shadows in the corners growing longer. The air felt thick, like he was walking through fog. As he stood inches away from the painting, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence felt deafening, and for a moment, Jack thought everything was fine. But then, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and Jack's breath became visible in the cold air. He shivered but couldn't move. His eyes were fixed on the king's face. There was something about it, something unsettling that made him feel as though the king knew something Jack didn't. He leaned in closer, almost hypnotized by the eyes that seemed to burn into him. Suddenly, the painting shifted. The king's mouth moved, barely noticeable at first. But as Jack blinked, it became clear. The king was speaking, and the words were not whispers anymore. They were clear, cold, and terrifying. "You shouldn't have come here," the king's voice echoed in the room, deep and menacing. Jack stumbled back, finally breaking free from the strange hold the portrait had on him. He gasped for air, but the words of the king kept echoing in his mind. He wanted to run, but his body still felt heavy, as if something was pulling him toward the painting. Jack knew he had made a mistake by coming here. But now, there was no turning back. Jack backed away from the painting, his heart pounding in his chest. The king's voice still echoed in his mind, like a warning he couldn't escape. "You shouldn't have come here." The words repeated over and over, each time sending a shiver down his spine. He had to get out of this place, but something in the air felt different now. The house seemed to close in on him, the walls feeling too tight, the air too thick. As Jack turned toward the door, he froze. The door was gone. It wasn't just closed, it had vanished. The hallway outside the room had disappeared as well. In its place was a dark void, stretching endlessly. Panic surged through Jack's veins. His breath quickened as he spun around, looking for another way out. But the room was exactly the same. The portrait of the king hung on the wall, and the shadows seemed deeper, darker. "Get out!" Jack shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. The whispers began again, this time coming from all directions. They were no longer just coming from the painting, they seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "You can't leave," the whispers hissed, each word sending a cold chill through his body. Jack rushed toward the window, hoping to break the glass and escape. But as he tried to open it, he realized it was sealed shut, as if the house itself had trapped him inside. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Was this some sort of nightmare? Or was the mansion truly alive, feeding off his fear? Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Slowly, the king's portrait seemed to change. The king's face twisted into a sinister grin, and the eyes, now glowing brighter than ever, seemed to mock him. Jack stumbled back, terrified, as the whispers grew louder, urging him to come closer. The room seemed to close in around him. Jack was trapped. Jack's heart was racing, and his hands trembled as he stumbled backward from the painting. His breath came in sharp gasps, his eyes never leaving the glowing face of the king. The whispers were now deafening, swirling around him like a storm. He tried to cover his ears, but the voices only grew louder, more persistent. "Come closer," the king's voice called again, now clearer than ever, filling the room with a sense of dread. The king's eyes glowed brighter, like they were pulling him in. Jack's legs felt weak, and his body seemed to move on its own, as though the painting had a hold on him. "No," Jack shouted, shaking his head. He was no longer in control. He wanted to run, to escape, but it felt like the walls were closing in on him. The room grew darker, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward him, as though the mansion itself was alive and hungry. The painting began to shift. The king's image twisted, and Jack could see something new, figures in the background, ghostly shapes that seemed to move behind the king. They looked like people, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes wide with fear. Jack's blood ran cold as he realized they were trapped souls, just like him. The king's smile grew wider, more malicious. "You are mine now," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Jack stumbled back, trying to escape, but the room had changed again. There was no longer any way out. The window was still sealed shut, the door was gone, and the floor beneath his feet began to crack. It felt like the entire mansion was alive, shifting and moving, closing in on him. The king's portrait began to glow brighter, the figures in the background rising from the painting, their ghostly forms reaching out toward Jack. He could feel their cold, clammy hands brush against his skin. "There's no escape," the king's voice echoed, as the room darkened even more. Jack could feel the walls pressing in around him. The mansion had claimed him.